It's that time again. The annual conference of the American Society of Ag Consultants, otherwise known as ASAC, is going to be held in Fort Myers, Florida, this November 4th and 5th. Kurt Covington is one of 9 professionals who will address the conference. The other speakers who will cover a wide range of topics represent Florida Farm Bureau, Florida Citrus Commission, University of Tennessee Institute of Agriculture, National Ag Law Center, Risk Mitigators and Advisors, Tyler Associates, as well as the lead economist for dairy at CoBank, and myself, Chrissy Wozniak from North American Ag. The day and a half of presentations will be followed by ag tours on Tuesday afternoon at Echo Farms, one of my favorite places here in Fort Myers. Attendees will experience farming at its most creative, with unique demonstrations, plants, and techniques being used to help farmers and urban gardeners in developing countries. A second tour at Echo will showcase simple technologies that can improve food, water, and shelter for millions of people. A third tour of a hydroponic grower is also being planned. For more information and to register, visit www.agconsultants.org. That's www.agconsultants.org. See you there. Today's Ag Spotlight episode is sponsored by Coolers. Make every day a cool day for your cows. The Coolers system allows you to control the cow's environment 24/7. For more information, go to NorthAmericanAg.com and find them in the Industry Connect section. Hi, and welcome to the North American Ag Spotlight. I'm Chrissy Wozniak. My guest today is Director of Government Affairs and Market Regulatory Policy for the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, where he oversees the cattle markets portfolio and serves as the staff liaison to the NCBA Live Cattle Marketing Committee. He regularly interacts with Congress, the USDA, the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, the CME Group, and other industry partners to ensure that farmers and ranchers maintain an efficient and transparent environment in which to market their cattle. He grew up in the cattle industry and attended the University of Idaho, where he studied agriculture, economics, and political science. I'd like to welcome Tanner Beymer. Welcome, Tanner, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Chrissy.
So on July 28th, the U.S. House Agriculture Subcommittee on Livestock and Foreign Agriculture, they held a hearing to examine the current challenges in the beef supply chain. And it was great to see that a lot of those who testified, they really echoed what the NCBA has been calling for in terms of expanding processing capacity. So can you tell me a little bit about what happened at that hearing?
Yeah, so this was kind of the latest in what has been a series of hearings on Capitol Hill in the Livestock Subcommittee. The House Agriculture Committee invited 4 witnesses to testify. All of them had more of an academic bent. They were all PhD economists, and they talked about a lot of things. They talked about the need to add more processing capacity into the system. You know, until we can start to see processing capacity come more in line with the current supply of fed cattle that we have, we're going to see that continue to be an anchor on cattle prices just because of economic scarcity. That's not to say that there's a shortage of cattle or a shortage of beef by any means. It's just a matter of the economic term scarcity, right? If there's more hooks than there are, or there's more cattle rather than there are hooks to process them, then that has a weakening effect on cattle prices. And so we talked a lot about the need for processing capacity. In fact, there was a recent study done last September by Rabobank that found that the industry could economically accommodate about another 5,700 hooks of daily processing capacity, which might not sound like a lot, but over the course of a year equates to somewhere in the ballpark of 1.5 million cattle moving through the system.
Yeah, that's a big impact.
Exactly. And we talked about that at length. And then in addition to that, this topic of market transparency came up a lot. You know, we talk a lot about that in the cattle business and how important it is to have adequate price discovery and a transparent market so that everybody knows kind of where the prices are at and they can make informed business decisions based off of that. You know, I think the most important tool that we have to that end is livestock mandatory reporting, which we've had for just over 20 years here in the United States. And it's a very useful tool for our producers so that they can have real-time market information. And some of the economists talked a little bit about ways to take that already very useful tool and make it even more impactful and useful for cattle producers. And so that's a lot of what that hearing focused on. If I had to boil it down to 2 main points, I think it would be that just market transparency and processing capacity.
That's great. And NCBA's Ethan Lane had commented that the roadblocks that are depressing profits for the cattle producers and endangering the steady supply of affordable beef have really captured the attention of lawmakers. So, do you think this attention will be short lived, or are they ready to get to work and solve some of these issues?
It would appear that they are ready to get to work. We've seen legislation introduced that would help bolster the processing segment of our supply chain. Congressman Dusty Johnson from South Dakota and Abby Spanberger from Virginia introduced a bipartisan bill called the Butcher Block Act, which would free up some federal funds for guaranteed loans or grants in some cases to small businesses, rural ventures, and perhaps even producer-owned co-ops that want to construct a processing facility or expand upon their existing capacity. Any hook that we can add into the system is going to be beneficial. It's important that they have sustainable business models to be able to withstand the volatility that is just inherent to any commodities markets, and cattle's no exception. And then it's not just isolated to Capitol Hill either. USDA recently announced that they're allocating about $500 million to the processing sector using money left over from coronavirus relief, which is something that I think is very important. We're looking forward to hearing the details from the administration on how they plan to distribute that. There is an active request for information that USDA has published. They're asking the public and industry for comments on how best to target those funds in order to have the maximum impact to bolster the supply chain and bring that capacity online in a way that's going to be sustainable in the long term. That comment period closes on August 30th, and NCBA plans to submit comments. And I encourage producers, whether you have direct experience in processing or perhaps a lack of processing capacity has impacted your operation, I encourage you to get those comments on the record and respond to some of the questions that USDA poses in that federal rulemaking. And then the last thing too, it's not just isolated on the House. We're talking today about the House hearing, but on that same day, on Wednesday, the Senate Judiciary Committee also held a hearing to examine competition in the beef supply chain. And there was a lot of discussion that went on there, mostly on market transparency and the need to have transparency in some of these market reporting so that we have better price discovery and a better idea of where the market is at any given time.
Right. Yeah. And why is it so important to expand this capacity for small, regional, and independent processing facilities?
Sure. I mean, like I said before, we're kind of at a point in our long-term cattle cycle where cattle supplies are really high. And, kind of as a result of the drought-fueled high cattle prices of 2014 and 2015, early in there, a lot of the packers closed their doors. Some of the bigger processors that have multiple facilities had some of their facilities go offline. And for the first time, starting in 2016, for the first time in over 30 years, there was a shortage of excess processing capacity, which basically means that there weren't enough hooks to process the current supplies of fed cattle. And that's had a downward pulling effect on cattle prices. Certainly, that was accentuated during the pandemic when we saw about 40% of our operational capacity go offline as plants temporarily shut down because of isolated COVID outbreaks, or even the chain speeds at those plants slowed down as a result of a shorter supply of a labor force. And then also just to implement social distancing protocols on the line. So the reason that we're so adamant about increasing processing capacity is because, we want to bring that supply and demand back into balance, right? So that you have an opportunity to bring leverage back to the cattle producer, right? We talked about scarcity a little bit earlier, right? If you can start to make cattle a little bit more scarce, then you dramatically improve the negotiating leverage that cattle producers have when they're marketing their cattle to the packer. The other way to do that is to reduce the supply of cattle. Part of that is already happening as a result of the terrible, terrible droughts in the West. I'm an Idaho boy originally before I moved to Washington, D.C., and I was home about a month ago, and it is about the driest I've ever seen. And my grandfather, who's 73 years old, told me it's about as dry as he's ever seen, and we definitely have it good compared to some other folks further south. So that drought is leading to an immense herd liquidation. We saw that reflected in the most recent USDA cattle inventory report. But reducing the cattle herd is not something that NCBA is going to advocate for,
for sure.
because we're seeing such high demand for our product at the consumer level, both here domestically in the United States and abroad in our export markets. Beef demand is incredibly strong and setting new benchmarks, it seems like, on a weekly basis. And so we want to be able to meet that demand. And so the best way to ensure that that happens in a way that's going to ensure profitability for our members is to increase the number of hooks in the system so that we can continue to have viable businesses on the producer side and satisfy that consumer demand.
Yeah, definitely. And then NCBA is also pushing to reform the product of the USA label so that it benefits both consumers and producers. So how will it do both of those things?
So currently, the product of the USA label is generically approved by USDA's Food Safety and Inspection Service. And what that means is there's no source verification that occurs to make sure that that product is actually of US origin. As a matter of fact, product that's imported from other countries is eligible to bear that label so long as it undergoes minimal or substantive transformation is the technical term for it.
Right.
But that can be as simple as repackaging. So product comes in from another country, it gets repackaged in an FSIS facility, it then is eligible to bear that product of the USA label. NCBA in June filed a petition with FSIS asking them to eliminate the product of the USA label, or at the very least change it to something more easy for consumers to understand, such as processed in the United States. Because we think that product has the potential to confuse consumers into believing that that product is 100% of U.S. origin. In that petition we filed, the most poignant example of this being a problem is a photo that we'd submitted as evidence from a grocery store here in the DC area that showed a cut of meat in packaging in a grocery store meat case that simultaneously said product of the USA in red, white, and blue. And then in tiny black print under the label, the nutrition facts, it said product of Uruguay. So that's confusing and potentially misleading to consumers. And so we want to be able to make sure that if our producers choose to market their cattle as a product of the USA, that actually means something and that they can verify that. And so we feel the best way to do that is through voluntary programs, such as through processed verified programs, which are overseen by the Ag Marketing Service at USDA. And there's a bunch of different PVPs. Think things along the lines of non-hormone treated cattle or natural cattle, things of that nature.
Right. Yeah. And also the NCBA cites to help defend family farms against the absolutely devastating proposed tax hikes. So what is the NCBA proposing for that?
We have a pretty extensive policy book on the subject of tax policy. And look, our number one priority is going to be to reduce the tax burden on America's food producers, in our case, cattle farmers and ranchers. That has been our priority and will continue to be so. And then secondary to that, and kind of along with it, it's going to be safeguarding those victories that we've won along the way in helping make sure that the tax system is fair to those people who may on a balance sheet look like they are quite wealthy, but we always talk about in agriculture we're capital rich and cash poor. That needs to be reflective of their tax obligations. Right now there is a major piece of legislation being debated in Congress and with the administration on domestic infrastructure. And that is a multi-hundred billion, in some cases, I've at the beginning when we started negotiating this, it was a multi-trillion-dollar package. We got to be able to pay for that somehow. And one of the ways that this administration has proposed to do that is by reforming the tax system. We've been really concerned by some of these conversations about eliminating the stepped-up basis, increasing capital gains tax. The death tax falls under that category as well. And we want to make sure that this administration understands that that is not a tenable solution for agriculture. We have already been faced with major black swan events, from COVID-19 to the fire at Tyson's Holcomb processing facility. These are things that farmers and ranchers are still recovering from today, and they're operating on very narrow margins. Increasing their tax burden is not the proper way to pay for this infrastructure program.
Yeah, that's it. And they need, the producers in all of North America need to start being protected more. And you guys are doing a great job of pushing this stuff forward.
Well, thank you.
And another area of concern is the regulatory flexibility for livestock haulers. So there has been some progress in this area too, right?
There has been a little bit. We've seen some pieces of legislation introduced, and we have seen multiple emergency extensions of hours of service, right? Because particularly during the COVID pandemic, this was incredibly important. We talked about this shortage of beef processing capacity. Well, when some of these facilities temporarily shut down because there were so many COVID outbreaks in the meat plants, those cattle had to be moved to other facilities that were still open. And had they not been able to be on the road the necessary amount of time to do so, then the impacts from COVID had the potential to be tremendously higher than they are, than they ended up being. And so when we start talking about hours of service, we really do need to make sure that, we're not categorized in the same bucket as those that are hauling widgets, right? We are hauling live animals. There is an animal welfare component that is involved with making sure that we can get those animals to and from their destination in the safest way possible. And we can't do that oftentimes when we have these burdensome regulations that, are very well intended. Everybody wants to be safe on the roads. But again, we're hauling a live animal, and that needs to be taken into account as the administration starts to look at some of these rulemakings.
Absolutely. And what about 30 by 30? The NCBA wants to ensure that obviously the private property rights are protected. So how is that conversation developing?
Yeah, so 30 by 30 I'm not sure quite how to characterize it. It's not an order per se. It's an idea that this administration has and what they want to accomplish. They want to conserve roughly 30% of the U.S. land mass by the year 2030. A lot of the country is already owned by the federal government. In the Western United States, some states like Nevada are as much as 85% owned by the federal government. There's a lot of opportunities for the federal government to kind of engage there, and from a conservation standpoint. From NCBA's perspective, though, we want to make sure that working lands are factored into that, because we can conserve land or we can preserve it. Preserving land is a total hands-off approach, and that is what results in catastrophic wildfire like you see in California and invasive species overgrowth. Those lands need to be actively managed, and the best people to do that are ranchers. They have a vested interest in making sure that that land is left in a better condition than it was when they got it. There's a generational aspect. Most family ranches are multi-generational, and they have a vested interest in passing it on to their children, their grandchildren. But there's also an economic incentive, because if that land is not productive from a vegetative perspective, then that's having a direct impact on that rancher's ability to earn a livelihood. So as we start to talk about 30 by 30, we want to make sure that in the conservation sense, there's a path for working lands. And that's not just limited to private property. Most of our ranchers in the Western United States, their livestock spend at least a portion of their life on federal grazing allotments, be it through the Bureau of Land Management or the Forest Service, or in some cases, U.S. Fish and Wildlife or Army Corps of Engineer owned land. There's no shortage of federal agencies that have control over lands in the West. And we need to make sure that their presence is accounted for as a conservation metric. We have all this research that shows that you can control the spread of invasive species, you can capture more carbon in the soil, you can mitigate the effects of catastrophic wildfire, all by just having grazing animals out there on the landscapes. So that has been our number one priority as we engage with this administration on this 30 by 30 initiative.
Right. Do you know what the percentage is now? If the goal is 30%?
That's a great question, right? And I think it all kind of depends on how best how they define conservation, right? And this is a little bit outside the scope of what I deal with. The Public Lands Council, which is a sister organization to NCBA, is really the one that's taking the lead on this issue. So I don't have that figure offhand, but again, it really does kind of depend upon the definition of what constitutes a conserved landscape.
Yeah, that's it. So is there anything we as people in the industry, in agriculture, that we can do to help these situations?
You know, kind of bringing it back to the cattle markets, because, that's my bread and butter. It's what I work on a regular basis here in Washington, D.C. It sounds really cliche, but as a cattle industry, we have to remember that there is far more that unites us than divides us. Oftentimes we can get bogged down in disagreements about things that occur within our own industry, but we need to remember that there are other threats to our industry and on the whole and in its entirety. I think the most poignant example I can think of that is during Wednesday's Judiciary Committee hearing. Senator Booker made a statement. He recently introduced a bill that would destroy the cattle feeding sector if it were enacted. It's called the Farm Systems Reform Act. And during his comments in the Judiciary Committee hearing, he said that livestock production poisons our air and our water and tortures animals. So if we're going to be successful in preserving this industry for the next generation, we can't allow ourselves to get caught up in the infighting. Everything we discussed in those hearings was important, and I don't want to detract from that, but we have to keep our eye on the ball if we're going to keep some of these actual existential threats at bay.
Absolutely. And I have one last question for you. So why are you devoting your career and life to these issues that affect producers?
I grew up in the cattle industry, and I'm very fortunate to have that background. And I think that oftentimes the biggest barrier to success on the ranch comes from red tape. And oftentimes that red tape is established by people that don't have a firm grounding of why we do what we do. And it makes a lot of sense, right? I don't want to make this a comment on, the fact that we need to educate consumers and educate the public on what we do. I think that is important, but I also don't think that we should approach it from the perspective of, well, you should understand why it is what I'm doing. You shouldn't be involved in my backyard. Oftentimes a lot of our generally accepted management practices on the ranch would seem very, very foreign to someone that doesn't know, have the same background or the knowledge as to why we're doing what we're doing. So I kind of decided that the best place for me to do that was here in Washington, D.C., because that's where a lot of the big decisions get made. And I've been really fortunate to be able to do it for the past 4 years.
Right. Well, that's awesome. Well, thank you for everything that you do. And thank you so much for joining me as well. I really appreciate your insight and that the fact that the NCBA is actively fighting for producers across America.
You bet. Thank you for having me on today.
Yeah. And thanks to all who are watching or listening. If you want more information, the links are provided in the show notes. Don't forget to subscribe to North American Ag Spotlight on our YouTube and Rumble channels. And the podcast is available on Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, Amazon, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And thanks so much. Have a great day. Thanks so much for listening to today's Ag Spotlight episode, where we put the spotlight on people and companies doing great things for the agricultural industry. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple, Amazon, Spotify, Stitcher, or on your favorite podcasting platform, and give us a 5-star review. You can also follow us on YouTube and Rumble to see the video version of Ag Spotlight. Also, head on over to NorthAmericanAg.com to subscribe to our Industry Connect update newsletter. If you're interested in advertising opportunities, email us at connect@NorthAmericanAg.com. Thanks for listening.